So the purpose of today is to welcome people into this space, which has been put together by ProClima, which is ProClima New Zealand is a company that's owned solely by ProClima in Germany. And for about 40 years now, Lawrence and some of his colleagues and people that he's put around him have been looking at ways to deal with moisture in buildings. And now ProClima, on the face of it, sells wraps and building membranes and tapes. But the reason why we do that is to make buildings better. And we do that through the control of moisture and air in the building envelope. And the reason why we do that is to make people healthier and more comfortable in those buildings. It also has some other great consequences like saving energy and maintaining the integrity of that building so it doesn't rot and fall apart like certain hospital buildings in Auckland. And the way we encourage architects to design those features into buildings and get builders to build them, because they're not required. You can build a building without using any ProClima products. The way we do that is through education. And I've been on board here for 8-10 months, but I've actually known ProClima for a lot longer than that, known John and Thomas and the team. And the reason for that is largely because of the first 10 years, well, the first 5 years of the 10 years that ProClima's been in the country, a lot of that time was spent going out into the marketplace and just educating about airtightness, educating about moisture control, about ventilation. And we're still doing that, and that's a really big part of what we need to do to raise awareness among designers, builders, but also the consumers and the people who actually end up living inside those buildings. So I'm stoked to now be involved more closely, and I get to do that on a regular basis by looking after this venue, welcoming people such as yourselves. And I also encourage you, if you have ideas for how you might like to use this space for future events with your own team, or there are other people you'd like to connect with that maybe we can help with, then we've got all the space out there for doing practical training, we've got this space for doing this type of thing, we've got a boardroom, and we also have shared workspace upstairs. So lots of ways that you can use the hub here to forward your agenda, which hopefully will also forward our agenda as well. Toilets, if you haven't found them already, through the door to the side of the other building, up the corridor, men's first on the left, women's further along. Please feel free to get up and wander around if you need to. We will be in here for about 2 hours scheduled to finish up round 3. We do have to finish relatively on time because our guests, at least one of them has to get to the airport. So we will try and keep things moving along. So I'd like to introduce, I'm going to introduce both Max and Ian, and then I'm going to sit down and shut up for a while, let them take the stage, and then towards the end of the session we'll pass the microphone around and give you the opportunity to ask questions. This building's not perfect. Far from it. We'd like to say that it is, and we'd like to be showcasing a perfect New Zealand building. But we've messed it up, and we are looking at ways to fix it. One of the things that we did mess up was cooling and ventilation. It's quite embarrassing, really. But it is what it is. And I raise that because we'll play around with what we've got, and that's why we've been cooling it down a little bit this morning. But I also think it's quite relevant to the industry of where we're at. We made this building airtight and put in heaps of insulation so it performs really, really well in winter time. What we need to do is figure out how we can design buildings that work all year round. And in fact, we don't need to figure that out because we are not that special. New Zealand, as much as we like to think we are, is not that special, and we're not that different from other parts in the world. So what we can do is learn from the experiences of other people and other designers in other parts of the world to figure out what's worked well, what is working well, what hasn't worked well, and we can learn from those mistakes, which is part of what the intention of today is. So, I'd like to introduce Dr. Max Sherman. Dr. Max has his PhD is actually in physics, and he's been noted to say that engineers are the ones who messed up energy efficiency. It's scientists who are likely to fix it. I say that because I'm an engineer. But I also worked as a building scientist for a short space of time as well. As I said to the small group this morning, the list of credentials from Max is very impressive. Serving as on the board of directors of ASHRAE, which, does anyone know ASHRAE? I'll let Max explain what ASHRAE is. And also a fellow of the International Society for Indoor and Air Quality and Climate. Has represented the US in the International Energy Agency, and also sits on a number of national and international committees and editorial boards. He's also an expert in duct tape, which I hope you're going to tell us a little bit more about your expertise in the world of duct tape, because that is something we can relate to. Also, quickly, Dr. Iain Walker, who is a scientist also at Lawrence Berkley National Laboratory. Iain's area of expertise are similarly in the area of retrofits, zero and low energy homes, heating, ventilation, moisture control, and also simulation of building modelling and commissioning buildings, something that we don't do enough of here in New Zealand, and also diagnosing problems. He's executive editor and a board member of the Home Energy magazine, and is on the task. He's a task group leader for building and duct systems at American Society of Testing Materials. He's on the National Standards Committee for IAQ at ASHRAE as well, and is along with...
Move around, Matthew.
Ah, yes. I'm proud you went to 62.2, which will be great bedtime reading for me later on today. And I'm glad Iain mentioned it this morning, but he was quoted in an interview with Alison Bales a couple of years ago that we used to ventilate mostly for just odour and moisture control, basically when things start to smell bad. But now we're starting, we being educated and more mature markets, are starting to think about the actual health consequences and the health implications of airtightness and poor ventilation. So we're in for a bit of a treat today, so that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Max. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the things that we've learned in the US and North America, Western Europe, that probably are useful to you because we've been at it a lot longer. Hopefully you'll find our successes and failures to be useful going forward. First, before I go further, first a non-commercial commercial. The AIVC, the Air Infiltration Ventilation Center, is an IEA annex, of which New Zealand is one of the early members, actually, and BRANZ is your relationship to that. And they produce lots of information that is available to you. I have brought a newsletter and the latest ventilation information paper. Not enough, just enough to pass around. So here, pass those around. So have a look at it. All of this is available online, so that if you're interested, note the website, and you can have at it. The story of duct tape is pretty funny. And I'm not going to tell it now. Maybe if we have time at the end, I'll tell a little more of it. But the reason why it's important is relevant to a significant difference between North America and the New Zealand situation. In North America, most all the homes are heated by central air systems for their heating and cooling and what have you. And so there are lots and lots of ducts. And we discovered in the early 90s that those ducts leak and that was a huge energy waste. So in the later 90s, we were asked by the California utilities to tell them which ways to seal ducts worked and which ones didn't. And so we did a big research project, we invented a test method, we looked at everything, and the bottom line was that pretty much every system that was commonly used to seal ducts worked except duct tape. So this was found to be very amusing by the mainstream media, and so we got a lot of press coverage, and it's my personal 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol once said, is related to duct tape. And that story is pretty amusing. But the important part of it for us is to understand that central systems tend to mix air, and that's the most common system in the US, whereas the most common system in Europe and here in New Zealand is to do individual space conditioning, room heating, or the like. And that can be a difference when we get into details. But we'll go through the presentation. If there's something that's completely unclear, please stop and ask, although we'll wait for most of the discussion until the end. And I'm just going to go through a bunch of seemingly unrelated things that hopefully are all of some interest to you. You already heard the overly long introduction of all the things that I've done, but I've been doing this a long time. My first trip, in fact, here to New Zealand was 1987, when I came to Wellington. And in 1987, it struck me that the general condition of the housing stock was relatively low compared to much of the other developed world that I'd seen, but that nobody seemed to care. The people seemed okay with it, the government wasn't unhappy with it, and so that was the condition. I'm quite encouraged to see that there's now much more of interest at many levels at stepping forward to making high performance, health and safe homes. So to me, that's pretty good. So just some background stuff. Well, what is air infiltration? Air infiltration is the interaction of air leakage, which is the opposite of airtightness, of course, and the natural forces of the temperature and the wind that will drive air through holes. And so that was a driving factor for the formation of the Air Infiltration Ventilation Center in 1979, because most of the energy-consuming countries were really worried that buildings, particularly dwellings, were using a lot of energy because they were leaky. And in fact, it was quite true. So one of the things that you have to do before you can get a handle on anything is you have to measure it so that you know what it is, whether it's big or small, whether it's good or bad, and whether you've made a change. Infiltration is something that is an air exchange within the home, and so you tend to measure it with fancy techniques like tracer gases, where you release something that you can measure and you watch it dilute and you can figure out what that is. But airtightness is part of infiltration, and that's measured a very different way. It's measured by using a blower door, where you put an applied pressure on a building and you see how much airflow goes through it, and that's a characteristic of the building that's independent of the weather, and that's very good because that's something you can control. You should get the same result whether you measure it on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or during the day or at night or that sort of thing. And in the early days, I was involved in developing the test methods that are currently used. In the US, we use an ASTM standard. In Canada, we use a CGSB standard. Those standards were combined to form the ISO standard, 9972, which is an international standard on airtightness. They're all somewhat similar based on the same building physics. So why is infiltration important? Well, as I said, energy was the driving force originally, and when we started, as soon as we got a handle on it, we kind of estimated that a third to a half of the building stock in US and Western Europe not particularly off the building stock. The building stock, a third to a half of the energy for space conditioning was due to air leakage and infiltration. So that was a very big chunk to be had. So air tightening had a lot of potential. It seems to have been true as we have gone through over the years. If the same fraction is still true, it's a third to a half, we have gotten the number to be smaller as we make more well-insulated homes, better windows, tighter homes. It's still an important fraction. In leaky homes, the ventilation, that is what's necessary for indoor air quality, is supplied by infiltration. That was the way it was for us in the U.S. In the 70s and even into the 80s, that it was supplying us, although it was costing energy, it was supplying a service of building ventilation. Of course, it has lots of drawbacks. It's not infiltration isn't a constant thing. When it's colder and windier outside, you get more of it, which is probably what you want less of it. And that leads to draft and other sorts of problems. So is there a looseness problem, especially in the building stock? Certainly there is. Buildings that are leaky lose a lot of energy. And of course, if you're interested in carbon reduction and having a small footprint or sustainable buildings, you need to cut that down. Leaky buildings are also uncomfortable. People don't like draft. They use more energy if you're heating the building, which is of course an issue in New Zealand. But if you're heating the building, you're going to heat it higher if it's drafty. The infiltration that goes through wall cavities, you can take away some of the insulation value of the air that's going through it. And one of the biggest problems is that leakage transfers moisture, and that can lead to moisture problems if it's not handled correctly. And if you want to control your building, if you want to make a high-performing building, you need to control that leakage to be small enough that you can deal with it in your building systems. So in hot, humid climates, leakage can lead to moisture problems. Now that's probably more an issue for your friends across the Tasman than it is here. But in Auckland, you nevertheless have a pretty humid environment most of the year, and you have to pay attention to allowing mold to form, because mold is actually much like us, or maybe like North Americans, maybe not like Kiwis, in that we like a certain nice temperature range. We like to be not too dry, to have water to drink, and food to eat. You give mold those things, it's going to grow and be happy and produce spores, and it's going to be very happy, but you're not going to be very happy. And so you cannot usually control the food source, because dust in the air is food for the mold, as well as virtually any wood product is food, including paper, is food for the mold. And if you heat your buildings to keep them in any reasonable temperature range, it's going to be an okay temperature range for the mold to happily chop away. So normally it's moisture control that is mold control, and so that's why moisture is so important. Well, can there be a tightness problem? Can you get buildings too tight? Well, certainly if you don't have a ventilation system and you make tight buildings, you're not going to get enough ventilation. It's going to be too tight. Unless people open windows, you're going to need a mechanical ventilation system, and people don't tend to open windows too well. Sealing can cause unintended consequences if you don't pay attention to what you're sealing and what the airflows are. Pressure management can be difficult also in too tight a home. If you have a very tight dwelling, you have to think about every airflow. Every airflow must be balanced. You cannot have an extract fan without thinking about where the air is coming from. In a traditional leaky home, you don't think about that. It's just going to come in through leaking. So there's a solution to having tight buildings. You issue everybody one of these things, and then they won't have mold problems. Walls might be a little moldy, but then at least people won't be sick. People often ask, is there a magic optimal tightness level? The first answer is no, tight is good. Ian's, was this your dissertation that you wrote that? Yes. There is no hole for all seasons. There's no magic hole that's the right size such that you get good ventilation, good indoor air quality, and not too much energy waste. So even if even if you could find an optimal tightness level, and you can sort of find an optimal tightness level, that leaves a lot of energy on the table. A lot of savings can be had if you go even tighter. So the answer is the phrase that many of you have probably heard, build tight and ventilate right. This is not a new phrase. This was coined by a Swede named Arne Elmroth in, I believe, 1979, when the Swedes were undertaking their program of tight buildings and ventilation. So the idea has been around a long time, and it's a good idea. And getting to it can be difficult, but the idea itself is pretty good. So I said yes and no, and so, well, is there an optimal tightness level? There is a point at which you can probably get enough ventilation in the air and not have to put in mechanical ventilation. That tightness level was someplace we stopped at in the US for several years in the process of getting to where I hope we are now, which is on the verge of build tight, ventilate tight. And that point can be useful as a stopping point, but you may want to skip right over that. And now, maybe not in existing buildings, because in existing buildings it's going to be much more expensive to put in things like ventilation systems. But a building tightness level can be a stop on the road to build tight, ventilate tight. So a question that's often asked, and was asked by our California Energy Commission of us, was, can you use windows for ventilation? And so we did a study to see in California how much people use their windows and why they use the windows. So, because one would think, in theory, for mild climates, which is has some, that operating windows to give you ventilation might be a fine thing. And in theory, it is a fine thing. But we found out that in practice, it wasn't. There's a saying that in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're not. So we found this out. I won't go into those graphs, but what they basically say is that people only tended to open their windows when it was too hot inside and they didn't want to use their air conditioning. Most California houses have air conditioning. So they would use them for overheating, but they would close them a lot. There were 20% of the homes who reported never opening any windows all year long. And then there was 20% who used them somewhat aggressively, and the rest of the people tended to use them only for overheating. And there are many reasons for that. The outside environment may not be great either in terms of air quality or in terms of noise. It may be for safety. They're worried about people coming in or throwing things in or that sort of thing. Or privacy in a high-density environment. They are too close to their neighbors. So there were many, many reasons why people closed or did not open their windows. So the upshot of this is that in California, where we do have ventilation standards, they took out the ability to use open windows as a means of compliance. So here's a bit of an interesting plot from history. This was the first plot we ever did using graphical type stuff. This is 30 years ago that we did it. And what this is a plot from the first air leakage database that we put together. This was a database of about 5,000 airtightness measurements across the country. And that's not a lot for 300 million people. But it was all that was around at the time, so we did it. What you're seeing is what the estimate of the annual infiltration rate would be for the different spaces. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that the lowest that's marked is 0.7 in the red, and the highest in the purple is 1.5. Just for reference, the target that we were thinking was the minimum back then was 0.35 air changes per hour. So pretty much most of the entire country was way, way too leaky. This corresponds to something like between, 14 and 30 air changes per hour at 50 pascals for those who are geeky and know what that means. So this sort of confirmed what people sort of knew, that air tightening programs were going to be quite effective at saving energy across the 80s. Oops, something horrible's happened. have I done? Ian, fix it. Oh, here's that. Oh, there it is. It's these damn Macintosh things. I don't know.
Computers, Max.
Yeah.
I'll never say gone.
Yeah.
No, I'll be in the computer.
There must be a way of doing it correctly, but I don't know what it is. Okay, so this is an example. As I mentioned, there were 5,000 homes in that first database. About every decade or so, we've managed to have an administration that thinks it's important to know what the housing stock looks like, and we've updated the database. And so there's been a trend in how homes getting tighter across the years. So you can see here the trend in tightness for when the homes were constructed. And although I don't have the data plotted on this plot, the typical new U.S. home is about 5 air changes, 50 pascals on this plot. And high-performance homes that are built to any kind of a high-performance standard, like Energy Star or Building America or things like that, are more around 3 air changes. So there's definitely been a progress over the years at improving tightness. So that's been the story. In the late 70s, early 80s, we were definitely focused on envelope tightness. In the 90s, from our research point of view, we were less focused on envelope tightness, but from the implementation point of view, the envelope tightness was becoming more. We were looking at things like duct tightness back then. And then we switched to thinking about, hey, we're going to be successful at tightening up our homes. We need to think about how tight, how to get tighter, and what to do about ventilation. So we began turning our attention in the 90s to minimum ventilation requirements because we knew that indoor air quality was going to become a major barrier to getting that energy savings and air tightness. So there are lots of barriers to getting air sealing improvements. So one of them is the concern for indoor air quality degradation. At the time, all this sealing business was new, so there was lots of reluctance for people to accept it because it was a new technology. As always with any new technology, there's increased first costs, and so people need to be convinced that there's a payback to the increased first cost. Now, surprisingly enough, those increased costs tend to go away over time, that it becomes, you find cheaper ways of doing it so that it's not. There weren't also a lot of people out there who could do it. You know, there were blower doors, but not very many blower door people, who could come to do it. There were weatherization and sealing people who knew how to do it, but not very many. So it was the infrastructure. And then there was the various market forces of people who didn't want to change. The system was working for them. They didn't want to go to something new because they might lose market share, they might not do it well. It was a risk, and a real risk. So it almost always involves policy options from some level of government or regulatory authority. And I've listed here what I think are the 6 main policy tools that those decision makers have. And every situation is different as to which tools to work. The government can invest in public interest type research, so that can be BRANZ, or if you have extra money, we'll be happy to take it to Lawrence Berkley Lab and do research for you. And that often begins it. Information is another relatively easy way. For example, it's not clear that Kiwis know that running your home at 12 degrees is unhealthy for you. And that'd be the kind of thing to be done. Incentives for improved performance are also good. We tend to do that in the U.S. often through utility programs where they use regulated money to incent higher performance buildings in order to not have to build new capacity to deliver electricity. Labeling is another market scheme that often works, where you have some certified authority who gives a label for how good something is, and then the marketplace can determine whether that label is of value. Ian's going to talk a little bit about ResNet, which is the HERS labeling that's most common in the U.S. And of course, there's regulation. Now, in the U.S., regulation is never very popular. Currently, it's even less popular than usual. We don't have national building codes or standards. Building codes and standards are very local. It's typically done by the county. So there's something like over 3,200 different counties in the United States. So that's a lot of different detailed codes. Now, they tend to copy from codes from an independent organization called the ICC that generates model codes, but they have to come up with them themselves. Some states, like California, have state energy codes where they do augment the local codes with other things. And of course, the final tool that governments can use is to tax inappropriate behavior like energy taxes. That's a suite of tools that can be used. So I talked about California, and I want California as a bit of an example. California is the richest, most populous state in the U.S. If it were a country by itself, it would be the sixth largest GDP, so we're a pretty big country. The state uses 16 climate zones when it does things having to do with energy. If you look here at climate zone 1 and 3, which are the two along the coast, the Pacific, by the way, on this map is on the west. Those two are very similar to North Island climates. So they're cool, they're damp, they get ocean breezes. So they're reasonably cool. But if you look at, for example, climate zone 16, that's the center of Australia. That's so we have quite a range of climates. So in fact, the only climate we don't have in California that we typically have in the U.S. is the hot, humid climate, because California is mostly dry, away from the sliver of the coast. But California also is one of the states with the largest commitment to the environment and to a low energy future. So they have the highest number of regulations around. So the California approach to regulation is called Title 24. That's just the name of it. And it's a set of building regulations. The law states that they can't regulate energy without considering the environmental impact of what they're doing. And that means they have to look at the indoor environmental impact. And for that reason, they adopted ASHRAE Standard 62.2 as a requirement to show that the indoor environmental impact would not be, the indoor environment would not be negatively impacted by the energy features that they have. Now, it's one of the strictest codes in the country for regulation, but since it's a mild state, we don't even in fact have tightness requirements. You may take credit if you measure the tightness and show it, but the credit for energy is actually pretty small in a mild climate. So that's an interesting fact that other places use tightness limits, but California hasn't. So whenever we're talking about requirements, regulations, mandates, there are a lot of players that perk their ears up and get involved. So the builders, of course, are one of the first things we have. We have many builders associations in the country. The most important one, the largest one, is the National Association of Home Builders. They are, they're also the most conservative one because they represent every little homeowner, every little builder in every climate, and most of those are conservative who don't want to have to change what they do. But then there are other builders associations. The Leading Builders of America, LBA, is the association of the largest home builders, so the people who build most of the homes. And these are very large businesses, and their interests are quite different from the small home builder in a rural setting, because they're going to build lots of homes, and they care about things like liability, they care about getting enough tradespeople to do work, so they have different interests. Then there's a group called EBA, and they deal with the energy and environmentally sensitive builders who are very forward-looking. So they have a lot of products. I think Ian, you're going to talk a little about those as well. CBIA is the California Building Industry Association. So that's a state organization, but of course the state has 35 million people in it. So it's a rather large organization, and that's a relatively progressive builders association because they're connected to California. Then there are lots of public agencies that are involved: the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. These are all federal agencies who get involved in both energy efficiency and indoor environment. Then there are a bunch of code bodies and regulators, as well as ICC. ICC is the company that essentially makes model codes. They don't have a nonprofit, they don't have a public interest mandate like the federal agency did, but they write the code that most of those 3,200 jurisdictions will adopt. Raters and retrofitters are part of the infrastructure, and we talked about ResNet. There's a companion organization, BPI, which does the training for ResNet. We can talk a little bit about that. And then at the bottom we have people like us, the national laboratories, who are paid for by the federal government to try to do the research. So all of these players tend to be involved at different levels in all of these things. As I mentioned, the builders associations, they're quite different in their approaches and their interests, and they don't always agree amongst themselves, let alone with each other, about what the best direction for the society to go is. A key part of what we have to do moving forward is generated in principle by the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which was the last time we had a significant Energy Policy Act. George W. Bush had an Energy Policy Act, but the main output of that particular one was to change daylight savings by 2 weeks to save an enormous amount of energy. So, but the Energy Policy Act of 1992 had very broad sweeping goals. Unfortunately, it didn't have much teeth in it. So its goals have not been particularly achieved, but it did start to lay some things down that allowed future progress to be made. There's been investment in the codes because of that. The Energy Star program in the U.S. that many of you may have heard of was part of that. And it was also the thing that required home energy rating systems, or enabled home energy rating system, of which ResNet is the largest one. So on the federal side, most of the programs were all voluntary. As I said, the federal government has never been big in regulation in this way. So these are programs like Energy Star, which at the beginning, Energy Star was as a brand, really. That was its point, was to put a seal of approval on a certain level of house. You made it, you didn't make it. One of the biggest fights we had early in the day in Energy Star is they did not include any ventilation. We know well the person who was in charge of that program, and there were wrestling matches that lasted several years before they finally put in ventilation. So you need ventilation in an Energy Star home. Building America is a different kind of program from Energy Star. This is an interesting sort of program. It was very effective for a while, and that was to work with builders. That teams were put together to work with builders to show them how they could change their designs to be more energy efficient and save money at the same time. The builders are initially always quite skeptical of that, and so there was a progression where you get to put one house, and you tested 10 houses, and then a subdivision. And it was very successful because turns out there's a lot of money to be left on the table, or when you build a building the old-fashioned way without designing it as a system. And the original Building America program was designed to show them how if you built the building as a system, you could, let's say, put in more insulation and reduce the size of the heating and cooling equipment, and the net would actually be positive for the builder. These days, we have various zero-energy home programs, which are looking to move up to the point of efficiency where solar photovoltaics can carry the load to make the home a zero-energy home. Now, they go by various different names, but that's typically where those programs are. So, ResNet is a company, I won't spend much time because I know Ian's going to cover this, that rates 40%, I think, of new homes, and gives them a label on a scale, and that scale allows people to compare compare how efficient their home is. And that some programs, like utility programs, will give them incentives to do that. The new ASHRAE standard 90.2, which is the residential energy standard, which will come out in the next 6 months, allows resident ratings to be used to meet the standard. There's a whole variety of things that residents can allow. Deciding what to do always depends on what the national goals are. And I'm sure New Zealand has generic national goals to reduce energy and carbon, to improve the health and environment of its citizens, the same sort of things that most countries could do. But you have to turn those into something a little bit more specific. In the building sector, you could talk about going to zero energy or high performance or low impact as goals. In terms of infiltration and ventilation, in order to do that, you have to reduce the energy or carbon footprint impacts of air leakage without causing moisture problems or other IAQ problems. So that means you have to enable the build tight and ventilate right philosophy, and that basically requires three things, I think. First is characterization and research. Second is infrastructure and institutions, and third is implementation and applications, and those are pretty broad. In terms of characterization and research, New Zealand is fortunate in the sense that a lot of people have invested a lot of time to date at the generic tools. Building physics doesn't change. Lower doors work the same in the northern hemisphere as the southern hemisphere. Physics and chemistry is the same. So all of that is sort of out there to be picked relatively easy. Now, learning the details of the stock is, of course, something that's country specific, and which technologies fit in the national context is something that has to be decided in the national context. So in terms of infrastructure and institutions, this can often be one of the most important things. First of all, you have to get people all along the chain, from policymakers to the builders, to the occupants, to the trades, to buy into the same goal and understanding what it's all about. And that often requires things like measurement, grading, training, and certification, and methods that are related to exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve. And finally, you have to actually invest in getting out there and doing it. This means outreach to the potential customers. This means changing building regulations, so the minimum that people are allowed is acceptable. And it means often working cooperatively with other groups like the AIVC that have done some of these things before, so you can learn the lessons that have worked and have not worked for particular things. Incentive programs, ratings, smart controls is one of the things that can often be quite useful, and you'll see one of the things that I passed out is about smart ventilation, which is the way of minimizing the impact that a mechanical ventilation system will have on energy use and occupant comfort. So if I have general recommendations, first of all, you need to define the appropriate targets. What is it that you really want to do? You may not need to go all the way to a passive house level of airtightness in getting homes there. People may want to, certainly can build a passive house, but you don't want that to be the major thrust, perhaps. You must have private sector institutions that are capable of carrying the ball of designing and building and selling houses and products that people will want. And from a public policy standpoint of view, you want to use some carrots and some sticks to shift the industry and the population towards those national goals that you decide. So I thought I would use this last part of my presentation to ask myself some questions and then answer them, because these might be questions that you care about, and then when I'm done asking me questions, you can ask me questions. Because a change in the paradigm, which is really what you're undertaking here in New Zealand, causes lots of questions, because a lot of key players have not thought about the new paradigm. And if you don't think about it well, you're going to get in trouble. Trouble usually, by the way, shows up first as moisture. That seems to be the most common way trouble appears. So let's have a look at some questions. Well, why do we want to tighten building envelopes? Well, energy is the first thing. If you want to have a good condition of your indoor environment, it's going to cost energy. You want to make that smaller. Tightening buildings is often a way to do that. Moisture is the second reason you want to do it, because you want to be able to control moisture flows so that they don't cause either the wall to rot or the indoor environment to become bad. So I mentioned that we had a U.S. database about air leakage, and we do. This is the more recent one than the one that the earlier graph was built on. And it shows you the distribution of leakage in our database. This is a raw database. You can see at that link below, resdb.lbl.gov, we have an application where you can query our database and produce answers from our data, which might be of interest to people to look at. But I just thought I'd show this this plot. Normalized leakage is the airtightness metric that's used in ASHRAE standard 62.2, which is roughly ACH 50 divided by 20 for those who know that metric a bit better, or is roughly the natural air change rate in an average climate in the U.S. What's important to see is that the distribution is almost always very skewed. Most always have a long tail of very, very leaky homes, which means usually you can target certain kinds of homes to save a lot of energy. And you notice the tail is still very long. This is still quite a high level of airtightness, high level of leakage in existing homes. Okay, will tightening cause moisture problems? This is something that I've heard a lot here that people are worried about, and the answer is essentially no. Obviously, we don't want to let rain or liquid water come in the home, so in terms of weatherproofing and keeping the rain out, you should do that. But in terms of air coming into the home causing moisture problems, that's not the problem. Moisture is generated indoors. The real problem is getting indoor generated moisture out. Now you can do that if you ventilate with dry air. Now, air at 100% humidity when it's 10 degrees is much drier when it's 18 degrees. So it has potential to dilute the indoor generated moisture. So often in New Zealand, I think the problem has nothing to do with the outdoor air. It has to do with the lack of heating and the low interior temperatures that seem to be quite typical. Now, of course, there are pathological cases where air leakage can cause it. And in hot, humid climates, you have to be careful where the air is condensing, although that's not really a New Zealand issue. But generally speaking, it's much easier to control moisture if you have a tight envelope than if you have a leaky envelope. Is there a tightness level where I don't need to have a ventilation system? As I said, yes, but it's not the best place to be. But for existing buildings in particular, it might be a good target place to be because of the cost benefit at the early time. But still, if you don't heat those existing buildings, it won't matter. You'll still have a bit of a problem. The other issue with this tightness level has to do with, or I should say, ventilation system has to do with what I mentioned in the beginning, and that is in New Zealand homes, we don't have anything that mixes up the air on a regular basis, which means that each space is up to itself, and you really want to be able to either deliver air to each space, or you want to be able to mix the air. That is best done with a design ventilation system in the New Zealand context. So it's really best to go to build tight and ventilate right, but you could see a stopping point for existing buildings not quite there. Perhaps I should have had this one early. What do ventilation standards have to do with tightness programs? And that is, if you don't ventilate, you can't tighten beyond that funny tightness level. You're going to have moisture problems, you're going to have other longer-term air quality problems from asthma and that sort of thing. So before you undertake to build really tight homes, you need to undertake to have mechanical ventilation systems installed. Now, should New Zealand consider leapfrogging over that building tightness level all the way to build tight, ventilate right? Well, yes, for sure, it should consider doing that. For new construction, it's eminently doable, provided you make all those other steps. Because then you have a highly controlled, well-designed system, and it will be on the order of what the best systems in Europe and North America are like. And New Zealanders deserve that sort of indoor air quality and efficiency and sustainable building. You may not be able to get there without a lot of investment by both the industry and the government in making sure that you don't fall into some of the traps that the rest of us fell into while we were stumbling along the way. This is a question I used to get a lot. It doesn't make any sense to me to pay to seal up a bunch of cracks and then add a fan that's just making more air. That doesn't make any sense. Well, that goes back to the fact that there is no hole for all seasons, and that even if you just consider the economics of the heating cost, it makes economic sense to tighten at a fan. And it doesn't usually cost a lot to tighten, by the way, I should add, but I'll get into that in a second. And these days we can do better than that with even smart ventilation, and that's the thing that you're looking at. So this is a little bit of an example of what I mean. This plot was something we did about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, of looking at the energy costs of tightening and then for the energy savings of tightening, but making sure that you met the minimum ventilation standards. So each of these rows here assumes that you've met the ventilation standard. The first row says that you don't tighten at all, you just, when necessary, add ventilation, and of course that shows an energy cost. All the other rows assume that you've tightened to a certain level, and then see how much savings you get from doing that, even with the ventilation system. And each one of those, and I won't go into the details too much, is a tighter and tighter level, with the bottom one being passive house tight. The other one that's of interest is the one that says AIVC standard. That's roughly 5 ACH 50 for this one. And you see that you get most of the energy savings. These are US national numbers, by the way, so there's a wide spread depending on climate. But you get most of the energy savings going to about 5 ACH 50, and then you get less and less energy savings that may or may not be cost effective. So that argues for at least going halfway to build tight and ventilate. Is it expensive to make a new home tighter? The answer is no, eventually, yes, initially, because builders have a way of doing things. Everybody does. And they build a certain tightness level. To build a tight home requires changing those things. There are many ways to build a tight home. You can use house wraps, you can use seals, you can use prefabricated pieces. There's many, many ways. And if you wish to make a building tighter, you can. And initially, you're going to have a learning curve. You're not going to do it right away. You're not going to do it most effectively. But what builders have found in the US is once they figure out how to do it, it doesn't actually cost them anything. Sometimes it even saves them money because they're doing things in a different way that makes something else even cheaper. So it's not expensive to make a new home tight. Making an existing home tight always requires a certain amount of effort because you have to go in and seal. You have to use weather stripping and caulking guns and foam caulk and all sorts of things. You have to find the leaks and then you have to fix the leaks. As a matter of fact, the first publication that we ever did that was outward facing towards the public, it had the two versions of it. The first one was called Stop the Draft, where we talked about stopping the draft through all this leaking. 2 months after we released it, Russia and the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and there was a talk in the US about restarting national conscription, which we call the draft. And the US government thought it was a very bad idea to have a pamphlet that said "Stop the Draft." so they made us take it back, and then we reissued the same content called with the boring title of "Find and Fix the Leaks." But I still have, or actually Rick still has, some copies of the old "Stop the Draft." This is an example of how much improve airtightness of an existing home by going in and spending roughly a man-day testing and sealing. And these are two subsets of our larger database. The first one is from the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is our low-income program for helping low-income people stay out of energy poverty, making their homes more efficient, and then that sort of thing. And the second one is from a residential energy efficiency program, which is taking sort of middle class and above homes and doing the same sort of thing. And of course, they're a little bit leakier to start with on the top one than the bottom one. But my rule of thumb is just you get about 25% energy saving or airtightness improvements by with a man-day of effort in existing homes. So that roughly gives you an idea of the cost of improving airtightness in existing homes. And so my last question to me is, should we focus on new or existing homes? And the answer to that one is yes. And both are very important. It's easier to make a bigger difference in new homes. You obviously start from scratch. You can have a design. You can build the right thing. But in terms of health improvements and energy savings, the vast majority of people are already living in those homes. And so you want to focus on that as well, because that's where you're going to make the biggest public sector difference. Now, if you're a builder, you don't care about existing homes. But if you're a policymaker, you should care about existing homes. So yes was an easy answer. With that, I can start taking your question. If that's what you want to do.
You can take that one now.
All right.
We're recording this, so we'll use the mic even if you think you can do good.
Could you remind me what BTL stands for?
Oh, that was building tightness level.
Oh, right.
Or limit, rather. And that, by the way, is a nasty phrase in the U.S. People really hate that word because for a long time we were stuck with it, and we all worked to get rid of it because there came a time when we knew better, but it was now embedded in the system that everybody loved it, and we had to sort of put a wooden stake in its heart, shoot it with silver bullets, and bury it in the backyard before it finally went away. And nobody wants to speak its name 3 times in a row because they're afraid that it will rise again. So in the U.S., it's not something that we're going to go back to. I mention it because it was a stopping place that for a while was very, very effective.
I know there are many standards around the world for air change rates for ventilation systems, but we've talked very well about the tightness level and then a matching ventilation system. So for a residential environment, is there a documented or from the top of your head, well-known air change requirement rate that gives comfort level and not at the expense of additional energy loss?
So you're speaking about air change rate for acceptable ventilation levels? Yes. Well, so I talked about ASHRAE standard 62.2, which is roughly in the neighborhood of 0.3, 0.35 air changes. It's actually more complicated. It depends on the size of the space and the number of bedrooms, but to get a handle on it, it's in that vicinity. The Europeans tend to operate a little higher. Again, their standard is phrased differently. It's about half an air change rate. The Koreans, I believe, have the highest one right now. It's about 0.7. But something to remember about these is that air change rates turn into liters per second by multiplying by the volume of the space, and not all countries have the same size homes. In the U.S., we tend to have the largest of those groups of homes. I think the average new home is 200, 250 square meters? 250 square meters is the average new home. The average new home in the UK is more like 80. So, and then obviously changes that sort of thing. In addition, if you're going to have a home where you have separate heating for each zone, and you separate each zone and you ventilate each zone separately, when you add it all up, it requires more air than in the US way, where you mix it all and everybody can get the same amount of air. So there's a bunch of small differences that change that number. But in that range is roughly where people have come to agree is what you need for acceptable air quality.
Could you tell us a little bit about the conditions of the homes that you were using when you gave us the graph for the energy savings for different air tightness? And I'm thinking about the average periods that homes had their internal conditions artificially treated, and whether that included cooling as well as heating energy savings.
Okay, so you're talking about that bar chart. So that was a simulation, obviously not measurements. Now, we have, in all of our energy standards, we have presumed thermostat settings. That is, in virtually every jurisdiction in the United States, it's required to have a heating system sized to provide 20 degrees, 18 is too cold for us, at the worst day. And many jurisdictions, well, some jurisdictions even require cooling in the very hot cooling time. So it was both heating and cooling energy, and it was based on thermostat settings that are common, and it was assuming that the home was with that condition band all the time. So that was the comparison. Obviously, there would be lower numbers if you are only running the system half the time, but the shape and size should remain pretty much the same.
So for New Zealand, should gains in airtightness, should we focus on residential or commercial buildings first?
Well, as a general rule for energy, airtightness matters more the smaller the building is. It's a surface to volume sort of thing. So for airtightness, generally, I would say dwellings would probably be higher priority, unless you're having problems with leaky buildings, leaky commercial buildings that are causing mold and moisture and other sorts of problems. From an energy standpoint, it would probably be dwellings.
New Zealand have got quite a few anti-condensation device providers on the market these days. I'll just be interested in your views on how these are performing and how they're affecting the well-being of the occupants.
Well, I don't really know anything about them, so I can't really talk about performing. Obviously, if they're effective, they're improving the occupants, because if they're keeping condensation down, they're keeping mold down, and that's going to be either a short or long-term health effect for the occupants.
Are you referring to ventilation systems explicitly? So that would be the difference between the positive pressure systems and balanced pressure system? I'm adding to the question, hoping I'm right. Yeah.
So you can control moisture with either one of those. It's generally going to be the rate at which you ventilate, and of course whether or not you heat that matters. So you can get down to the fine points. When you have balanced systems, you can have various forms of heat recovery and moisture recovery, and all of these products exist out in the international marketplace. But that gets to be kind of a fine point. Simple ventilation will do most of the drying out.
So a follow-up question from me then is, you said nothing helps in an unheated home. Is it going to be the same case with a unheated and slightly ventilated home?
Pretty much, because if we're talking about a New Zealand condition where the outdoor air is near 100% RH to begin with, there's very little drying potential in it if it doesn't get heated. So you're from a moisture standpoint, it's not going to help. If you're worried about other kinds of contaminants like VOCs emitted from materials in the building, it can help. But I was referring more to a moisture kind of problem where if you don't heat it, the air, it's not going to help you very much.
Cool. All right, what we'll do is hand over to Ian, and then we'll have a little time